Now let's just summarize what we have done in the elasticity of supply. Elasticity of supply is percentage change in quantity supplied upon percentage change in price, or it is change in quantity upon original quantity into price upon change in price, or change in quantity upon change in price into original price upon original quantity. Whichever you feel easier to remember, this formula you can do it. Then we saw how to interpret the numerical values of elasticity of supply. We saw when the numerical value equals to 0, we call it a perfectly inelastic supply. That means that the supply does not change by any change in price. That is, a change in price brings no change in quantity supplied. And on a graph, the supply curve in case of perfectly inelastic supply is always parallel to y-axis. Then we saw that the numerical that we get from the elasticity of supply may range between 0 and 1. And if that's the case, we call it a relatively inelastic supply. A relatively inelastic supply means that a bigger change in price brings about a smaller change in supply. That is, the price changes by a bigger amount, but the supply changes by a smaller amount. So we call it relatively inelastic. If the supply is relatively inelastic, the supply curve is generally tilted towards the y-axis. It is a steeper supply curve. What is unitary elasticity? Unitary elasticity is when the elasticity of supply equals to 1. And when the supply changes in proportion to a change in price, we call it unitary elasticity. That is, both are equal. Change in price and change in supply, both are equal. In this case, the supply curve is a bisector supply curve. That is, it bisects the origin into two equal angles of 45 degrees. And then we also saw that the numerical may range between 1 and infinity. If it ranges between 1 and infinity, we call it a relatively elastic supply. A relatively elastic supply means a smaller change in price brings about a bigger change in quantity supplied. Quantity supplied changes in a greater proportion than change in price. And in this case, the supply curve is flatter. It is tilted towards the x-axis. And in case of perfectly elastic supply, the answer is always infinity. Because here the price does not change, but the supply keeps on changing. No change in price brings about an infinite change in supply. And in this case, the supply curve is parallel to x-axis.